Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scribner, and today I want to talk about Austen and podcasts, one of my favorite things as of late. It was last year that I became super obsessed with Jane Austen, with podcasts, with the whole world of it, and I have been actively searching for Austen podcasts since, and I have tasted and tried many of them. I have only found 3 that I'm absolutely in love with them, and I want to share them. But if you have other favorites, please share them with me because I'm always looking for recommendations. And I think that this is a part of the Austen world that is new and often not talked about as much, so I want to just dive in and talk about some favorites. The first one that I want to talk about is The Thing About Austen, and this is hosted by Zan and Diane, and it is all about the really minute, detailed things, and I find it really enjoyable to find out those things. If you love world building, if you ever wonder what is that random thing, if you're a person like me who holds one hand in what you're reading and one hand in the appendix, and you're always going back and forth being that's what that word means. It talks about Marianne's dead flowers, about Colonel Brandon's waistcoat, and why is it flannel? Does that mean he's an old man? Does it mean he's sexy? Who knows? We talk about Wentworth's umbrella, we talk about Darcy, we talk about all of these different characters and Scrabble and charades and all of these things and what they meant during that time, which is just super cool because sometimes we have different understandings, and I just find often there's a deeper understanding. We find out about Anne and her newspapers and where that would have had the influence. How are the ways in which Napoleon or the slave trade or other things like that are quietly being talked about in the background without ever being told. I don't think Napoleon is ever referenced in any of these books, but the wars with Napoleons are literally the background of every single one of these books. And that's something that I don't think often gets talked about. Why do you think there's so many soldiers and so many people being elevated to soldiers and stuff? Because they're fighting a war. It's such an interesting podcast to learn so many details, and I just always look forward to it. I also did this when I was reading Sense and Sensibility, so it just made me super excited because I'd seen the different titles, and then I was oh, I can't listen to that one, I can't listen to that one, and then I'd dive back and forth. And then some things are primarily in one book, but they'll talk about where it is in the other books as well, which is super cool. My one warning is if you have not read a book and that is what that topic is about, I would definitely not read it because they will definitely go into spoilers for the entire book. The next one is my absolute favorite podcast. I think it's Pride and Prejudice. It is so wonderful. I wait up on Tuesday nights every second week to get the new episodes, primarily because it's Emma, and Emma is my favorite book by Jane Austen, one of my favorite books of all time, and I just can't wait for Molly to have the feelings, and I feel that's the joy of it, right? So Becca is a person who's read many of the Jane Austen books. She's an expert in many ways, and Molly is her very enthusiastic friend who knows nothing. Literally knows nothing, thinks that Darcy may in fact be a character, does not realize that Caroline has a crush on him for the longest time, and it's so funny early, Pride and Prejudice, where Becca has to be hey, so we're going to talk about some details. There's little jingles and stuff like that to remind us of key things the economics of marriage in Jane Austen and of courting and stuff. So it is very lighthearted and very funny, especially the give and take between Molly and Becca, because Becca does the thing where, she stares Molly dead in her soul and goes, neither confirm nor deny whether this is true or not. And it's just very fun to see the interplay of their characters. It's also very rewarding, as now we're on book 3. We did Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and now we're on Emma, as Molly understands more of the Jane Austen world and makes more connections between the different characters. And we're at the end of Emma, and she's getting much better at guessing the different characters, where in the first one she was a big fan of Wickham. And that was very interesting to watch her go through and be should we get shirts with saying Lickham, because I think Lizzie and Wickham will end up together. You can obviously tell that I very much love the show, and I have re-listened to Pride and Prejudice. I read Sense and Sensibility along with that. I'd already started Sense and Sensibility, and then I discovered the podcast, and then I listened to it episode by episode, and it was so great because it was already out, and I had read first 12 chapters, and I would just read the 2 to 3 chapters, and then I would quickly listen to the podcast, and then I would go back, and it was just such a delightful thing to do. And I feel especially over Jane Austen July, it just felt I was reading alongside them, and it was so fun. But yes, I really recommend this as a tool to read or reread the books. I think it takes them about a full year to get through each book, so it will be a while, if you're reading any of the other books. But for, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and, they only have probably 2 weeks left of Emma. So yeah, I think that it's a really delightful thing, and I look forward to it all of the time. The next one I want to talk about is Austen Therapy, and I really like this one as well. It is done by 2 Canadians, which always makes me really happy whenever I'm oh yeah, you're Canadian, it's great. This is done by Kate and Teresa, and they are two siblings who have a similar dynamic where Kate has read all of Austen and is a huge fan, and Teresa is very, very skeptical. It's quite funny watching them wait and have to take a while to actually trust Darcy or actually trust the characters. And they both have background in social work or counseling, so they talk about attachment theory, they talk about different ideas, kind of armchair talking about it as well. And it is definitely a very different vibe from Pride and Prejudice, but it has a similar dynamic and similar joy of watching people go through and reading books. They started with Pride and Prejudice similarly, but now they're doing Northanger, and I really love this because, it's often quite likely that people will go to the most famous works, and I really love Northanger Abbey. I want that redemption because I think it's such a fantastic book, and Kate agrees with me, so that's really, really great to go through it and to see the different things. And I'm really excited to it's fun to also have different people's takes and different people's understandings and likes and dislikes. And as someone who has a background in social work and counseling as well, it is super cool to see these dynamics and see the dynamics of talking about how we would think about these characters or what's going on, or people's trust and stuff like that. And I really, really enjoy going through those things. So this is also a super great podcast. And then we have one bonus podcast because this may actually be my favorite podcast. I don't know. It and Pride and Prejudice will definitely fight out a battle to the death, as we do. And this is Noble Blood. This is not specifically set in the Regency era or set in Austen era. And it does not specifically talk about Jane Austen, but I think that it allows a lot of context. I really, really love this podcast in general because it doesn't just look at royal families. It looks at anyone noble or connected with noble. She'll definitely make connections to talk about characters that she really wants to. It has more of the idea she is the single host, and she, with her wonderful voice will just narrate this story and sometimes have asides and stuff that are funny, or letting her point of view and stuff like that, and critique it from a more feminist or more modern lens, but in general tells the story with lots of compassion and lots of things. And she talks about a lot of Regency characters. I feel like I've learned so much more about the Regency era because of this, and because it's a favorite era of hers. And it is so wonderful. This is one of the podcasts I've been listening to the longest, and I have such an affection for it. So some of the characters that she talks about is the Duchess of Devonshire, and I actually have this book and it's on my TBR for this month, and it's The School of Scandal. And I have it on my TBR because it is set during the same time as Austen. It originally came out, I think, 1890s, and she was a young duchess, and she's not much older than Jane Austen herself, and lived in that time and stuff like that, and was very famous. And as we've talked a little bit about, Jane Austen was very involved in the theater and very influenced by the theater, so I think that it's cool to see some of the playwrights of this era and also see the ways in which famous people like the Duchess of Devonshire and stuff like that would have had influences on her world. I didn't actually have her on my list, but the Duchess of Devonshire was actually in friends with Marie Antoinette, who was a contemporary of Jane Austen as well, and she also had relatives, including her sister-in-law and cousin, who were during the French Revolution and got caught up in that. So that era was not necessarily British, but also involved with what was going on during her life, and she had family members, who had asylum in her home because they got kicked out of France. So it is definitely something really relevant. And then we also have, George III, his story, and the Mad King, and how his life wasn't actually that, dealt with madness until later on. We have a look at his wife, Queen Charlotte. We have a look at their granddaughter, Princess Charlotte. She was the beloved princess who would have become queen, and then she tragically died in childbirth, and then the race for the new heir created a situation in which Victoria became queen, and that's the transfer of power and stuff like that, which is really interesting. We have a look at the Prince Regent and one of his loves and his scandalous behavior. We have a look at George III's sister, who had a scandalous life that upset his early life because she became the queen of Sweden, and then she had an affair with her doctor, who then took over the government. Shenanigans are going on, And yeah, these are all stories that are set in the Regency era. They're all contemporaries of Jane Austen, and even though it's not Austen completely, I definitely think that you can understand the Regency era and also have a wonderful podcast. So if you have any other recommendations of podcasts or just history podcasts in general, I love history podcasts. I love, podcasts that look at women and stuff like that. But these are my Austen podcasts, and I would love some recommendations, and I hope you have a great Jane Austen July.